welcome to this week's story update. Today we're going to be talking with Charlie Poulson, but first let's take a look at his story.
My name is Charlie Poulson. I'm from Des Moines, Iowa, and I guess my story kind of starts going back to college when I first started transitioning. It was in Ames, Iowa, which is a little bit more on the conservative side. It's mostly an agriculture school, so when I came out and started transitioning, it kind of turned heads a little bit, and but I was very open about everything from like taking testosterone to surgery, and everything else that kind of came with the whole package of transitioning. But then in that fall semester, my last year of college, we did a study abroad trip to Rome, and this was the first time that I had gone somewhere after surgery where nobody knew my past. Nobody had known that I used to be a woman. So I was a little bit worried that if I wasn't passing, then something might happen to me. But luckily, the culture is kind of where like everybody kind of keeps to themselves. My one moment where I was just kind of like, okay, I can probably live kind of stealthy was I needed a haircut. It was, it was getting long, and I looked up barbershops, and I was like, all right, getting a haircut from someone who doesn't speak English at all. This is going to be a little difficult, but I'm willing to figure it out. And I was walking around and like turned a corner, and there was this little hole in the wall, like store, and it looked really cool on the outside. And I looked in a little bit further, and I realized it was a barber shop, but it was like a barber shop that like hadn't been touched like since it opened, probably like in the 20s or something. This little tiny old man with like white hair just like comes shuffling out from behind the curtain, and I just slaughtered all Italian skills that I had at that point, and I asked him for a haircut. And I had brought in a picture of like how I wanted it cut, because I figured, that would probably be the easiest way to go about that. But at the same time, I was nervous because I was getting a haircut in a foreign country in a language that I wasn't comfortable speaking fluently, and B, barbershops are kind of like almost like a rite of passage for any kind of like masculinity in general speaking. I was sitting in there, and on top of that, I was kind of worried, like, is he gonna figure me out? Like, what am I gonna do? But it just kind of like everything was totally fine. Like I didn't have anything to worry about. It's like the funny little things that like guys do between each other. Like for example, like if you don't know a guy and you are crossing paths with him, like you nod downwards, but if you do know someone, like you nod upwards. Like it's just little tiny like unspoken things like that. And like when he was cutting my hair, it was very like a very unspoken, like, don't worry, I've got you, I'm gonna cut your hair, like make you feel better, like you're good to go, like that sort of thing. That trip to Rome was like an entire turning point. It was definitely, kind of like an interlude between two different books or something. It was kind of like a taste of what my life could be like. It could be something where I have more time to focus on design and, things that I really enjoy doing, and I don't have to worry about, do I need to tell anybody that I'm trans? Do I need to like out myself? Do I need to, that sort of thing. I think this story is important to share because not very many people have conversations about transitioning past surgery. Like they kind of see surgery as like the end all, to every single like transitioning problem, but that's really, not the case at all. Like past surgery, okay, like great, that's done, but like how do you navigate the world past transitioning? You finally like have been on like testosterone or hormones long enough that you can navigate like your own emotions. But for example, when I first started taking testosterone, when I was getting the prescription from my doctor, he was going through a list of all things that could possibly happen, and you have to like legally sign off on every single one. And he suggested going to therapy the entire time that I'm on testosterone. And he's super sweet. He looked at me and he was like, you know, I don't think you personally need therapy. It's not your fault, it's society's fault. And, you know, it's kind of like, okay, how do I navigate that? So it's good to, you know, keep talking about things past top surgery.
Okay, welcome, Charlie. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Doing pretty well. It's good to see you again. We were just chatting before this, and yeah, it's been 5 years now. So I'm looking forward to hearing what's going on in your life. One quick thing about your story that I'm curious about the past 5 years is that have you had any other experiences like the one that you had in the getting that haircut? And I don't even know if there's a right phrase for that, but sort of like a affirming experience in some way that you can remember had an impact on you as that haircut did?
It's interesting because the way that I look at that experience is totally different now. So I remember like at that point in my transition, like it was so important to me to find somewhere that was felt like more belonging. And it was interesting to like look at that in terms of, like God, it's been like almost like a decade since I started taking tea. And so like back then, the objective was more to like fit in as like cisgendered as much as possible. Whereas like now I look at being trans as like a superpower. And I'm super proud to be trans. Whereas like before it was kind of like, okay, we're just gonna like slide in and like be like as assimilated into society as possible. Whereas like now I'm like, oh no, I actually like want to have like experiences like where I can say that I'm trans like very comfortably. But I think it was important to have those experiences like the barbershop, where I could like have that moment of like what it feels like to pass as cisgender. And it's like such a like double-edged sword of like early in my transition, like I wanted nothing more than to just pass. And now like if I see like other folks who are most likely queer identifying like out in public and like I want to make friends, like it's such a weird thing to like try to approach them and be like, hello fellow queers, like then I just look like a cis dude who's like trying to like chat them up. So it's it's funny because like now the barber that I go to, the shop is very like accepting and like there's actually a lot of other trans guys that go there. But it's not like a machismo situation where like you kind of have to like blend in or like they're not saying like super misogynistic things at all whatsoever. I've definitely been in other barbershops before where like that was kind of like the shop talk and like it was like super uncomfortable. But not quite like that. I think it has like changed a bit based off of like how I view myself as trans.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So you basically are saying, if I have this right, that in the experience in your story, you were so eager to fit in and blend in and not stand out in any way. You just wanted to pass as a man to other people, and now you it's almost like the opposite. You're like, wait, make sure that you know that I'm one of you, talking to queer people. Do you remember like the first time that happened, or the moment where you realized like, wait, how can I make sure that other people know that I am of their community? Was it like a moment as there was with the barbershop, or did it just kind of happen over time?
Yeah, actually, funny enough, it happened in Italy, in Rome, at the same
That's
time.
your place.
Yeah, it must be. But I remember I was on one of the trains, like going from our apartment to the studio, and I saw someone and the hard part about it is like I can't really assume that like people are trans. And like that's the hard part is like they might be in the situation that I was in where like all I wanted to do was pass as cisgender. So if somebody were to like spot me out as trans, like I would be not thrilled with that. So I saw someone who I thought was a trans woman, And at that point, like there was like nobody else who was queer in like the group of people that were over there. And like I just like so like desperately wanted to be around my community. So I saw this person and like so badly, I wanted to be like, hey, like in whatever like broken Italian that I knew to try to like explain that like I'm also trans, but like that's like when I was like, oh, okay. I'm noticing also that people are like staring at this person and like how uncomfortable like that must be. And like my staring probably is like not contributing to it, but like I'm not staring because I'm like gawking at this person. I'm like formulating in my head of like, is there some kind of thing that I can like flag or like say, or like a secret code word or a handshake or something, to like let them know that I'm part of their community, but I still haven't figured that out.
So when you were on the train, did y'all make eye contact?
Yeah. Yeah, we made eye contact. But I don't know. I feel like, I mean, for me personally, like I can usually tell when somebody is trans. I think just naturally, but also like I think I can usually tell like within their eyes. So I kind of was like, oh, this is like my one like string of like trying to make it work of like, can you see that like I'm also trans? Like it's okay. But yeah, nothing was ever said, and it just was like two people on the same train for like a very short amount of time. But
Yeah. So what would you say to someone who is kind of in your situation at the barbershop in your story? If they are, I know that you're in a different place now, but if someone was, looking for, they're at a point in their life when they're trying to fit in and blend in, and they're not ready to, they don't want to stand out in any way. What would you tell them or advise them?
I think I would tell them that their need to or their want to blend in is super valid, and like I totally understand like wanting to have that experience, because I think it better informs who you become as your true self. And so like for me, I don't think I would have like totally understood the value of like being out and trans as an entrepreneur, and that being like kind of rare. But I think it's also interesting to look back like 5 years ago, and like how I was working in the professional field and like how I look at it now, is totally different. But like I now like talk about being trans in like all of my work that I do, and like with all my clients know that I'm trans, and like it's super nice, and I have like really great clients now, and like I can say no to like ones that are really bad. But it's almost as if like being out and trans now is like a filter for like clients that I wouldn't want to work with in the first place. But I think I also needed to be in that spot that somebody else might be in now to understand like why those clients, who would not know that I was trans, and like that I would have to keep that a secret from me, of like why that's not healthy, or like why that's not something that I personally wanted, in the end. So it's super important to like get as many experiences as possible, and sometimes that's just part of that experience collection.
Got it. So what else is going on in your life? I know that when we spoke first, you were in Brooklyn as I was. Where are you these days, and what's going on in Charlie's life these days?
Yeah. So I'm in Portland, Oregon now. Lots has been happening here. I think we're on like day 200 something of protests, and they're still going strong. Um,
Wow.
it's been interesting. In terms of like work, like I'm definitely taking a more entrepreneurial approach now instead of just like working with agencies. So I've launched one business in the last like 2 weeks recently, and have been partnering with a couple people of launching some other businesses as well. So I'm like finally getting to where I wanted to be 5 years ago. So that's good.
What
Yeah.
what do you do? Can you tell people what kind of work you do?
Yeah. So I own Americano, which is a brand design studio, and we use a lot of like AI, and basically like make brands human, based off of like personality types. So a little bit different, but which is nice though, because from an entrepreneurial sense, I can use Americano to create the branding for other businesses that I then launch. So it's been fun. It's been a huge learning curve, but I've learned a lot in the last 5 years of like how to like be financially literate, and like realizing that like I wasn't at all, and like totally owning that and being like, okay, like how do I learn from this and how do I move forward? But like all kinds of stuff like that. Just being super humble with like learning new stuff, and um, admitting that I don't know everything.
That's always a fun and empowering thing to learn.
Yeah.
I think everyone hopefully continues learning that throughout their whole life. Well, Charlie, is there anything else that you want to share?
Um, yeah, not that I can think of really, but like if you know, if you gotta be, if you want to be stealth for a while and like get that experience, like by all means. But I think it's super important that at some point that people, you know, come out as their true selves and like use that to their advantage. Like I use it for work where I'm like, hey, like I understand like having to adapt to different like personalities, and like using that to talk to different people when I was in Iowa, and like I had to like navigate my way, like talking to people who might not have been trans friendly, but because I could have a conversation with them, they would be like, oh yeah, Charlie is just like a nice guy. Like he's not like coming to like disrupt anything, or like screw up my agenda or anything like that. So using that skill in work has been like super, super valuable. And it's not like something worth hiding about.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for sharing that. And thanks again for taking the time to chat with us. And of course, for sharing your original story. And if anyone has any comments, feel free to leave them in the comments. And Charlie, maybe you can check back off and on to respond to them if you're willing and interested. And for everyone else, check back next week for our next story update. Thanks for watching.